thought your video was very interesting. Obviously, you're very intelligent. And it's very refreshing to hear somebody who actually can admit that God does do evil things. Because it gets frustrating as an atheist arguing with, Christians and whatnot about that. I mean, it's painfully obvious that that's a part, the Old Testament is a part of their Bible. But your faith in God is even more bewildering to me than the Christian's faith in God, which is kind of ironic. Because, at least with the Christian belief, they had this addendum with this, where they add the love to it. They add the mercy and the forgiveness and everything to it. But, and I probably should do this, using your video so I don't miss any points, but I think I kind of have it in my head, the points that I wanted to make. I think first of all, as far as this whole conversation goes, I mean, you have to, at the beginning, you have to establish what your definition is of a God. And then after you establish what your definition is of a God, what constitutes a God, you also have to establish what constitutes evil. What is evil? Is evil just a religious concept, or do we have a secular notion of what evil is also? I mean, in my mind, evil is what doesn't work, what doesn't have a positive outcome. The only people or entities or whatnot that I don't know, that would consider doing an evil act, the outcome of an evil act, the only ones that would consider that a positive thing are ones that are broken or are not working. They are abnormal. They are not healthy. So if we look at God in the sense of that he is the evil demiurge that I think a lot of us see him as being, especially looking at the Old Testament, Torah as you call it, it's hard to accept that a God, which in my definition, and maybe your definition is different, a God should be perfect. A God should be, at best, superior, and I would even go so far as to say far superior than the things that he created. If we can see that our morality is better than that of God's morality, then there's a problem. And not so much, and you make the excuse for God that, well, he's God. Which, we hear that from Christians too. Well, you can't understand God, and, how can you question God? And how come you're not able to be humble enough to worship God? Well, first of all, we have to establish what is a God. What do I think a God has to be in order to be a God? And you really you have to establish that first. But I think that it's easy to see that we can go against a God. I mean, like I started to say, you made the point that what's the point of, somebody had said, I think under your other video, something along the lines of, what's the point of even questioning this? If God is almighty and can do whatever, then, and we can't go against it, and that's a good point. If we can't do anything outside of his will, and if, as you made the point, that innocent people can get smoted by God, what is the point of worshiping him? Because you're hoping, you're just hoping that maybe you doing the rituals that you do, the prayers that you do, that's going to keep this God from killing you. When obviously, if somebody, who's never prayed, who's never had the opportunity to even decide what they, believe in or what they don't, can get smoted by this God, what difference does it make? And where are your morals in this? I mean, how do you feel about, and if you want to say, okay, how do you feel about a ruler that rules this way? Like Hitler, like, any tyrant that we've had here in the world. How has that worked? Has that worked? I mean, is that a good way in your mind, logically, to rule? Does it work out for the ruler? Usually a tyrant or somebody like that, yeah, sure, they might have a few years where they're on top and they're, might makes right, and they end up, having people in servitude or whatever. But especially nowadays, it doesn't work out very well. Usually the people come together and they rebel and they, assassinate you, overthrow you, whatever they have to do. And the idea that we are incapable or we cannot rebel against this God is painfully, obviously incorrect. I mean, I'm rebelling against this God. If I can do it, you can do it. Anybody can do it. And you can say, oh, well, yeah, but, you're going to get yours after you die. Okay. And I've made this point before, too, that even if your God does exist, I would rather burn in hell than to worship something that defines himself as, this might makes right evil tyrant that creates life just to, have them be living in a fallen world. And just, if he wants to smote them, he smotes them. If he wants to kill innocents, he kills innocents. Because why? Because I'm God. And he does a lot of these things, and you can see a lot of these things even in the Old Testament, just as you pointed out, where he sets these things up. He does intervene in free will. And he does it for what purpose? I mean, in Job, he does it to prove a point to Satan. What kind of a God has that kind of priority? I mean, you're making the case that yes, he does evil and yes, he created evil, but now we can see in that book that his priorities are such that proving a point to this fallen angel is more important to him than not allowing Job to who was righteous. Job was righteous prior to this. It doesn't matter to him. He's willing to let Satan do whatever, just in order to prove a point to Satan, Lucifer, whatever we're calling him. And this is what you have to ask yourself. If the whole idea of the Torah was for God to communicate to us who he was, do you think that the point of that was just to know who he was or also to know how to live? I mean, didn't he give us the 10 Commandments, and wasn't that kind of a gesture of, look, I'm going to give you these instructions and I want you to follow these instructions? And really, it seems like a lot in the Bible, even besides just the 10 Commandments, was showing us how to live and what kind of people to be, what he wanted us to do or not do. And yes, a lot of that involved only worshiping him and all those very narcissistic things, but he's basically giving himself human attributes, and not just human attributes in the good sense, but human attributes in the things that we would say, that even we would say are immoral or are sinful. I mean, killing people that are innocent. And it almost sounds like, it seems like you've even made the point that, God can't murder. I'm assuming that this might be how your argument goes with that maybe you think that God can't murder because he's the one that gave life. Well, that would mean that any mother that's ever killed their child is not a murderer because they gave that child life. I mean, that's the same logic behind that. And then you're going to go, well, yeah, but he's God. You have to, and I think that you would think that, we have learned in our history, in the world's history, that you have to be very leery of what you're believing in and what you're worshiping, and you have to question authority. And I mean, for your own good, for your own safety's sake, and because it's logical. It's logical. You have this God saying, I'm the only God, and there's no other gods, before me, and he wants you to do this, and he wants you to do that. And the majority of the things he's telling you he doesn't want you to do are things that he's showing you that he does. It doesn't make sense. Now, if we go back to the whole evil thing, if evil is in fact, or if you define it or agree with my definition of it, that it is in fact a flaw, then that almost kind of says, that's almost kind of your proof right there that God is not real, that God doesn't exist. Unless your definition of a God is that a God can be very humanistic, that a God is very much like us. And, you could make the point with, well, we were made in his image. Well, You're making the point that, God is good, God is evil, but not so much that he is all of either, but that he just is. Well, what do we need redemption for from, acting evil, being sinful? Why do we need to be redeemed for that in any way? Why should we apologize for that in any way? I mean, there will be punishment here if you're bad. But why should we have to ask for forgiveness to a God who we are just acting in his image? He created us in his image. And if his image involves evil, if his image involves, total evil tyranny, and of course, again, you're going to make the distinction that we are not God. Our sole purpose is to worship God. But isn't there a lot of talk also in there, and I'm assuming this isn't just in the New Testament, but isn't there also a lot of talk about righteousness and being righteous and being just? How is that justice? How is that righteousness? That's what I don't understand. I mean, it's just like the whole thing with him wiping everybody out with the flood. Why did he do that? I mean, to him, he condemns evil. He himself condemns evil. He himself condemns the majority of the things that we have been shown that he does. Shown by his word, his book, his message to us about who he is. So if his message to us about who he is completely contradictory, then we have to question that. We have to question if this is really a God, and then is this God worth worshiping if this God even did exist? And the answer to both those things is no. I mean, and this is what I find weird, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but isn't it odd that, atheists and people like yourself, that we agree on these things, yet atheists, kind of take it to the point where they can see this stuff, and so therefore they make the conclusion that there must not be a God. But with you, for whatever reason, this is why I'm saying it's more bewildering to me, your faith. You can see these things, you can see that this is an evil God, yet you still have faith. It's very strange to me. And sometimes I think maybe the whole point of this whole thing, let's just say there is a God. Let me just be hypothetical for a minute. Okay, maybe your God does exist. If your God does exist, and he really is about righteousness, and he really is about justice, and he really is about good, and the only time, and the only reason he was able to do these evil things is because he's God. But maybe you would still agree that he doesn't want us to do those things because we are not God. Okay, let's go with that premise. But if he really wants us to be righteous and to be just and to not do the things that he can do because he's God, because we are not God, it doesn't make sense that that would be an issue. I mean, we know what justice is. We know what mercy is. We know what righteousness is. And it seems like we know these things even better than this God. If he wants us to be these things and do these things, it almost seems like, and I guess what I was trying to say, I kind of lost my train of thought for a second. I think it almost seems like we're supposed to reject this book. If there is a God, if this God is real, let's put it this way, if your God is real, it seems like he would think, or he would hope, or he would want us to reject this. Have you ever thought that? And even for me, that's kind of a real crazy thing to think, but if your God has anything to do with righteousness or justice or love or mercy or whatever, if that has any part to do with him, even partially, even if he is capable of evil and everything else, you would still think that maybe the real answer, and maybe what we're really supposed to do, is reject this book. Because this book is basically showing us that this God is not those things. You know, in other words, maybe we're supposed to read this and go, well, this is not the real God, because this God isn't righteous, this God isn't merciful, this God isn't love. In which case, maybe there is some other God out there that is the real God that we still don't know about. Maybe this was just a lie. I don't know, just saying. So anyways, I think for the most part that pretty much covered everything that I wanted to say. And another, there was one other thing as far as with the Christians and the New Testament, and the fact that that added the love and added the forgiveness more so than even, I think, the Old Testament, the Torah. I mean, I've never read the Torah, so, you know, maybe you can correct me on anything that I maybe don't know about the Torah. The Old Testament, I don't know if that's exactly the same or not, but whatever. But, you know, if you take all that kind of stuff out of it, like you were talking about ritual, and I mean, if just the ritualistic act of doing things is what God wanted, I mean, that doesn't say a lot as far as spirituality. In the sense that it's a physical act. I mean, in other words, if the rituals don't really represent more spiritual things, which is kind of where we go when we get to the New Testament, that's what we're taught, then it kind of takes a lot away from those things. In my opinion, and I think really factually it does. I mean, what we eat, what we don't eat, if we pray, if we don't pray, how we pray, where we pray, if we're baptized, if we're not. If those don't have the meanings behind them that we learn about, or that they created, however you want to say it, in the New Testament, then that also kind of takes some of the powerfulness or the deity, you know, the deity away from this God, who is supposed to be, you know, an entity, a spirit, a supernatural being. So again, like I said, it comes back down to, how do you define a God? What constitutes a God? I mean, and if we keep going back and forth between, you know, what is a God, and okay, here's this God that's giving us his message and telling us who he is, but yet we're going to turn around and say, well, yeah, we don't agree with those things, and those things don't make sense to us, but it doesn't matter because he's God. I mean, we're going in this big circle of illogic, I think, by doing that. We have to define what constitutes a God in our own right. And I mean, and the whole thing with, you know, well, God is not here, God does not do miracles like he used to in the Bible, he doesn't intervene with things, he doesn't, I mean, to me, that almost makes him impotent in and of itself, because he's not active, at least not that we can see. Number one. Number two, if he's capable of doing evil, and, you know, I don't want to go against my initial response to your initial question with this whole thing, and that being that I said that no, a God doesn't have to be good. No, a God doesn't have to be good, and I still agree with that. There, you know, we can define a God as somebody who is an evil demiurge. In other words, that basically is an evil God in a sense. Sure, there can be an evil God, but again, it comes back down to the question, why should you worship, why would you worship an evil God, especially if said evil God is trying to tell you that he wants you to be good. He wants you to be righteous. He wants you to have mercy. He wants you to love your fellow man. And that's another question that I almost forgot. How can you say that you're loving your fellow man and there's love in your heart if you're capable of worshiping a God that is okay with or willing to kill innocents? And yeah, you can go back to that, well, yeah, but he's God. But there is an inconsistency there. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, you know, I'm going to worship and love this God who wants me to love my fellow man, yet his book that he divinely inspired, that he wanted me to read so that I would know who he is, shows him killing innocent people. But I'm going to excuse that because he's God, and so I'm just going to worship him anyway. It's almost as if, I guess what I'm trying to say is your worshiping of this God is an act of unrighteousness. Because you're worshiping something that's unrighteous. You're worshiping something that's not merciful, not loving. Yeah, there's times when he is. There's times where he does show mercy. There's times where he does show, and most of that is the New Testament. So, anyway, that's, I think, all I had to say. Oh, okay, one other thing real quick. The whole thing that you brought up with Abraham and Moses, I forgot about the Moses thing. But with Abraham, like I said, again, it all goes down to what is a God. This God allows Abraham and Moses or whatever to argue with him. Similarly with Job that I pointed out. You know, he allows Job to talk to him like man to man almost, mano y mano, you know. And not to say that a God can't do that, and I think that shows a lot of coolness on God's part. But you know, when I read the Bible, that was, I mean, it was like, you know, a scratch in the record. You're listening to music, all of a sudden it's like, zzz, you know, and you're like, what? When you get to that point where you got a human being showing more, it's almost like he's teaching God a lesson. He's showing God mercy and righteousness and justice and love. He's showing more, he's demonstrating more love than God is. And God's allowing it. Now, you could say God allows it because God really agreed with that in the first place, or, you know, whatever. I mean, if your definition of God involves him being omniscient, you know, all-knowing and all-powerful, well, then he already knew this conversation was going to happen between him and Abraham. And, you know, he already knew what his decision was going to be regarding those things. And therefore, maybe that was just a way to show us that, you know, we humans are going to question these things that God does. And, you know, God will respond to it, which is kind of odd for an evil demiurge, I would think, or I do think. But just the simple fact that, like I said, this is a demonstration of one of God's creations being more perfect than God, than the Creator. How does that work? How can you be better than the Creator? How can you have better morals than the Creator does when the Creator is trying to say that he is morality itself? He is righteousness itself. He is justice itself. Well, if this God is true, and what he says is true, then righteousness and justice and mercy includes being evil. I mean, we'd have to redefine all of those words. We'd have to redefine love. We'd have to redefine mercy. We'd have to redefine righteousness. We'd have to and we'd have to include evil in those things, which kind of is totally opposite of what we think they are. You know, but as I said, for Abraham and Moses to have made the case for their fellow man, and the fact that these were, you know, righteous people according to even God. But like I said, for them to make this case to God, to demonstrate this to a God who could have just smoted them, you know, if they ticked him off, to have the courage to do that. I mean, that did show their righteousness. So, I mean, on that, we can agree with God that, yeah, these people were righteous. But the problem is they were more righteous than God. Because had they not made those arguments, then even more innocent people would have been killed. And surely they didn't talk God out of killing people, period. I mean, the conversation with Abraham, I mean, Abraham got him to lower the number of people killed in Sodom if, you know, there was X amount of righteous people or whatever the case was. But there was still killing that was done. There was still punishment that was laid out for what they were doing. And maybe rightly so in that case, depending on what you think about that. But nonetheless, you know, how is it that in your mind a God can be less than what he creates? I I mean, unless your concept of God was that, you know, he was just bored and decided to create life in order to teach himself something. But again, to me, in my mind, in my opinion, a God should not need that. A God should be perfect. And a God should, at best, be better than the things he creates. And we can see by this God, by his own words, by the only story we have about him, that he's not better than his creation. We can even see that even he believed that he made a mistake. I mean, if evil is a mistake in God's mind, if evil is wrong in God's mind, then how can God be evil? Because that, you know, then he's not perfect, then he's not God. So the two can't go together, and you still come out having this, well, there is a God. It's a contradiction. It's a contradiction that cancels him out. It cancels God out. It cancels his deity out. It cancels his power out. It cancels him out as a God. He himself destroyed the whole world because they were hell-bent on evil. Apparently, being evil, or evil itself, is an imperfection. So, there it is.